All right, now we're going to look at the fall of the Roman Empire. One of those topics that remains significant for many, 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 many centuries to come. Now, by that, well, to tell that story, we really have to begin by thinking about what the Roman Empire at the end of the 4th century would have looked like. By the time we get to about 370, the Roman Empire is in the process of becoming Christian. Christianity is beginning to give the empire a new identity, a new reason for being. What is the purpose of having an empire? To spread the Christian faith. Who is behind the power of the empire? The Christian God. The Christian God has chosen the Roman emperor to be his representative on earth. At least that's how they perceive it. The Roman Empire is prosperous. It is still in very good shape around the year 370. It's a little bit smaller than it had been at its largest, but it is still the largest state in the world. By this point, it's pretty much existed as long as most people can remember. In 400 years, in roughly the situation that it's at this point, longer if you count the period of the Republic. The Roman Empire is prosperous. Most of the individual parts of the empire pay for their own government. However, a couple of provinces, Egypt and Africa Proconsularis, that's the northern part of today's Tunisia, provide most of the expenses that fund the great projects of the empire as a whole, provided an enormous army, things like that. And the Roman Empire in the year 370 doesn't really feel itself threatened. They only have one enemy who, is at all serious, which is the Persian Empire to the east. But the only frontier they have with them is in basically modern Syria, Turkey. Elsewhere to the south, the Romans border the Sahara Desert, and a few areas north of it lived in by small groups of not terribly well organized peoples, while to the north you have a similar situation with the various Germanic peoples. Now, the Romans, on several of their frontiers, both Europe, Africa, and Asia, have put various fortifications to maintain those borders. In general, most of the borders have constant minor skirmishing with the tribes living beyond them, and most of the borders have a relatively large military presence. There are walls built on, in some places, like Hadrian's Wall, seen here, that runs across the very northernmost part of England today. Can be seen in a ruined state, as similar structures in various parts of continental Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. However, these are not viewed as essential to maintaining the empire. The largest group to the north of the Romans are the Germanic peoples. The Germanic peoples live to a large extent on both sides of the frontier. Germany, or the German areas themselves, are very poor. People who live there live in small tribal groupings. Very few of them getting as large as perhaps 100,000 people in a single tribe. Most of them living in villages. There are really no towns among the Germans, let alone cities. They have a sort of symbiotic relationship with the Roman Empire. The German tribes are one of the main sources of slaves exported into the Roman Empire. They export things like uh, feathers, hair for making wigs, uh, but generally they're poor. Many Germans have immigrated into the empire, where they have joined the military, and some of them have risen quite high. Um, the main tribal groupings that you would see would be in the west, in roughly what's now the Netherlands, in Western Germany, the Franks, the south of them along the frontier, the Alemanni. Other tribes would include the Angles and Saxons further north, the Lombards, Vandals, uh, roughly in what's now Czech Republic and Poland, Burgundians, so on and so forth. Most of these are not even united tribes, but there are multiple bands. The only well-organized tribes among the Germans are the two Gothic tribes in the east who approach levels of actually having real kingdoms. The Visigoths, who live in more or less what's now Romania, which had been a Roman province. They had taken over about 100 years earlier, and the Ostrogoths living in what's now the Ukraine. The Visigoths, the western group of Goths, had begun to become Christian in the course of the 4th century. A man named Ulfilas translated the Bible into Gothic and begun spreading Christianity among the form of Christianity that takes off among the Goths and then spreads from them to other German peoples. It's Arianism, which believes that God the Son is not equal to God the Father, which will create problems later on. But at this point, the Goths are outside the empire. The other German tribes are outside the empire. And they all have relationships with the Romans where no one questions the Roman emperor is far, far more powerful than any individual German people. Beyond the Ostrogoths, we reach the steppe lands that begin in Eastern Europe and spread north of the Black Sea across from what's modern Ukraine into Russia and all the way eastward. And in these areas, there's some very, very different people who, as of 370, have barely crossed the consciousness of the Roman world. The Goths themselves, the Ostrogoths themselves, under a ruler named Ermanaric, have united much of the edge, the western edge of the steppe, under their own rule. That will be challenged. A new group of peoples, a group that people in the Roman world have not really registered consciously before this. It is the Huns. The Huns appear in the telling from out of nowhere. According to one version, they came out of the trackless swamp leading towards Central Asia. They conquer a tribe called the Alans, a people related to the Persians, in what's now South Russia, and then move further west, attacking the Goths. And we get descriptions of this from Romans and Goths, sometimes directly from Goths, sometimes by way of Romans. What they say is that the people who come from the east are deformed demons. One version of the story says that they are children of witches and demons. Another that they are children of wolves and witches. Either way, there's a suggestion that the Huns aren't quite human. There are suggestions that they're deformed and strange looking. And oddly enough, this is probably somewhat based in reality. This is the skull of a Hun. The Huns practiced something called cranial deformation, where they bound the heads of their children tightly so that their heads would be long and stretched out, like this, to make them rather odd looking as adults. On top of that, Hunnish men believed that when someone died, man should not cry tears of water, but should cry tears of blood. So it was normal for Hunnish men to cut their faces whenever someone died, meaning that by the time they were adults, most Hun men's faces would have been a mass of scars. Further, leading possibly to some of the crazy descriptions, the Huns seem to have come from the very far east. They seem to have been related to the Xiongnu, who had attacked China earlier, the Hunas, the White Huns, who had invaded India, and some at least of the Huns seem to have been of Far Eastern racial category, which to most people living in Europe and Africa around the year 370 would have been very strange looking. Add all of these together, and they look like no one the Goths, the average Goth or Roman, had ever seen, with their stretched out heads and scars, riding on their little horses, and coming, as it seems, from nowhere. The Huns would have spent most of their lives on horseback. Their horses, a Hunnish warrior would travel with perhaps as many as 10 horses, changing from one to the next so that he could keep going without wearing out a horse. This allowed them to move much faster than anyone else. They would have had powerful bows that they would shoot from. They were like nothing anyone in East Central Europe had seen before. The Goths go out to meet them. The Gothic army is destroyed. At the end of the battle, the Gothic king, Ermanaric, commits suicide, and his kingdom collapses. Most of the Ostrogoths, the Eastern Goths, falling under the control of the Huns. This battle would be repeated over and over again in legends for centuries, and curiously enough, is the kernel of many of the traditions that J.R.R. Tolkien will borrow in writing the Lord of the Rings. Now, the Goths flee from the Huns. The Eastern Goths flee into the land of the Western Goths, tell them that the Huns are coming. The Goths panic and flee further south and westward, leading them to the Roman frontier. And they reach the Danube River. And when they do, they beg the Romans to please let them in. The Huns are coming behind them and will kill them all. There are tens of thousands, possibly as many as 300,000 refugees who all show up on the Roman frontier simultaneously, asking for asylum, asking for food. They are there with their wives, their children, their entire families are trying to come into the Roman world. And the Romans on the frontier begin letting them in. However, something happens. According to a later author, the treacherous greed of Lupicanus and Maximus was the source of all our other evils, tracing back the mismanagement of this refugee crisis to everything that comes after. When the barbarians, after their crossing, were harassed by lack of food, those most hateful generals devised a disgraceful traffic. They exchanged every dog that their insatiability could gather from far and wide for one slave each, and among those who were carried off were also the sons of the chieftains. It is these Roman officers in charge of the border begin abusing the Gothic refugees. They strip them of their weapons. They harass the women. And seeing starving people, they take advantage of them, selling them dogs in exchange for their children. These are a warrior people, a proud people, and this humiliation will not stand. And of course, there are other Goths who have come across the border without going through border control. They have brought their weapons with them. They will join with those who have gone through the official crossing points. And all of the Goths, all some 100,000, will revolt. The revolt spreads across the whole of the southern Danube area, with these refugees attacking Roman fortified areas, looking for food, looking for better treatment. The Eastern Emperor, at this point there are two co-emperors, one in Constantinople and one in Rome. The Eastern Emperor, a man named Valens, who is the junior emperor, decides he will go out and deal with the Goths. He is supposed to wait for the Western army to come under Gratian. However, he realizes if he waits, Gratian will get the honor of defeating the Goths. And at the city of Adrianople, which is today right on the border of Turkey and Greece, Valens meets the Goths. He thinks he is dealing with a few barbarians who know nothing. Instead, he and the entire Eastern Roman army is killed. Valens' body is not even found. He died at some point in the battle. This is only the second time a Roman emperor has fallen in battle without being recovered. And it is the biggest defeat of a Roman army since the time of Hannibal. It is a catastrophe. The Gothic army, with all of the refugees with them, press on from Adrianople and even reach the walls of Constantinople itself. They're not seeking to conquer the empire, they are seeking safety, peace, and food. And knowing this, the new emperor, Theodosius, who we met earlier, will gradually bring them under control, dividing them up, making agreements with some, until finally all of these Visigoths have been pacified. They are given a status of being federati, that is, federates, and they are given autonomy within the Roman Empire. They're allowed to keep their own king, and much of the territory of what's now Bulgaria is given over to them. They're allowed to settle. In exchange for autonomy, land, they are expected to send their young men to serve in the Roman army. Theodosius will use them repeatedly to fight his enemies. He, over a course of a few years, becomes sole emperor. He fights various rebels, Magnus Maximus and Eugenius, who both seriously challenge him for sole control of the empire. Each time, Theodosius relies on the Visigoths to provide the bulk of the army and especially the soldiers who will be sent into the most dangerous situations with the greatest possibility of dying. This is not going to win Theodosius the love of the Goths. However, it seems to have created a stable enough situation. When Theodosius dies, he divides the empire between his two sons. Honorius will receive the western half of the empire. In the western half, he will first rule from the city of Rome. Later on, he will move his court to the town of Ravenna. The other son, Arcadius, will be in power in Constantinople. They're both young. Neither of them seems to have had the talents of their father, and both of them are under the domination of German soldiers. In Constantinople, they quickly maneuver things to eliminate most Goths and other Germans from positions of authority. In the West, things are even more problematic. The Huns, who have not yet reached the Roman Empire, move further west again, away of Germanic peoples, including many of the Goths who had remained north of the empire, come fleeing into the Roman Empire. This time they are quickly defeated and dispersed across the empire. The Visigoths, meanwhile, under the leadership of their king, Alaric, decide to leave the Eastern Empire for better prospects in the West, and Alaric leads the Visigoths into Italy. His goal seems to be to extort various benefits from the empire and to gain a greater position for himself and his men. Well, with the Gothic army moving into Italy, the Honorius and his chief general Stilicho, seen here, he's half German, strip away the Roman army that defends the northern frontier along the Rhine. They declare Alaric and all of the Goths to be enemies of the state. The Huns move west yet again. And now comes a really unfortunate, for the Romans, conjunction of events. The winter of 404-405 AD is one of the coldest in Northern Europe. The Rhine River freezes solid. Along the river, where the Roman army, its garrisons have been removed, tribes of German peoples fleeing from the Huns gathered, seeking to enter the empire. The river frozen, they walk straight across. These will be the Alamans, the Burgundians, the Vandals, the Sueves, and the Alans, a non-Germanic people. All of them move into Gaul, that is France, and will begin moving freely around the country, seeking loot, seeking food, seeking potential new homes. So problems are getting worse and worse. Meanwhile, with the Visigoths on the loose in Italy, Honorius flees to the city of Ravenna, which is in the middle of a swamp, and cannot be attacked from land this time. He will spend most of his reign trying to get chickens to tell him the future. Presumably, they did not tell him what to do. The Visigoths move on to Rome. They put it under siege twice. Each time, the Roman government buys them off with food, gold, spices, all sorts of things, and they pull back. The third time, 24th of August, 410, the Romans are unable to get the Visigoths to go away, and Alaric and his men enter the city of Rome. During the sack of Rome, Alaric captures the sister of Honorius and Arcadius, Galla Placidia, who will later on marry a Gothic king, as well as a Roman emperor. They strip much of the wealth of the city, especially going after the remaining pagan temples. Because, curiously enough, these Visigoths, barbarian invaders of Rome, are almost to a man Christians. They're not the right kind of Christian, but they are Christian. And they make a point of leaving churches alone. They leave after 3 days. They have not completely destroyed the city. Much of the city is still standing. They have not killed that many people, but it is the first time in 496 years that 796 years that a enemy army has entered the city of Rome. It is a shock. The idea that Rome could be captured by an enemy causes everyone across the empire to be confused, upset, and angry. And the blame game will begin immediately, probably as early as August 25th, 410. Certainly, we have things written at the time where the pagans will begin blaming the Christians, saying, is it just a coincidence that only 17 years earlier, the father of Honorius had shut down the temples of Rome, and the Romans had turned their backs on the gods of Rome for this new god, that now, since the gods of Rome since the Romans abandoned the gods of Rome have abandoned the Romans. The Christians, meanwhile, say it is the pagans' fault because so many people were undermining the Christianness of the empire. Oh, and by the way, it's not like there weren't any worse disasters back when the pagans were in charge. Now, the Goths will begin to try to leave. They attempt to move to North Africa. They are unable to get ships, and they go back towards the north. It is not the end of the Roman Empire, but many Romans feel that it just might